Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of 75 or so organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And I also teach at Suffolk University. And our guest today is Michael Hattem. Michael Hattem is the director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, and he is the author of two really good books about remembering the past. His first was Past and Prologue, about politics and memory in the American Revolution. And his new book is The Memory of 76, the Revolution in American History. So thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
So it seems like we know what happened in the Revolution, and we've always thought about the Revolution in the same way. And often we think, boy, if we can only get back to that spirit of unity then. But your book shows that we've been arguing about the Revolution really since it happened.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, as most historians of the revolution in the early national period know, the founders themselves really didn't agree on what the revolution meant or what its quote unquote first principles were. And so this book really explores the sort of long history of how Americans have defined and redefined and fought over the meanings and the legacies of the revolution. And in doing that, I'm trying to uncover something about this unique role that the revolution has and has had since the very early 19th century in our political culture and just in American life generally as a sort of national origin.
Right. It just occurred to me that in his inaugural address, Thomas Jefferson, he talked about the Revolution of 1800, meaning a return to the principles of 1776. And he wrote to John Dickinson and Samuel Adams, and we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists. But he gets to this position by defeating John Adams, who was his partner in creating the Declaration, which is.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very 18th century notion, right, of revolution. Yeah. Is the idea not of creating something new, but of returning to something, and that's really a key part of the memory of the revolution, because in the 18th century, a lot of people thought that history worked cyclically rather than in a linear fashion,
right?
And that meant that empires sort of rose and fell, and as a sort of inevitable cycle over time. And one of the ways that people in the 18th century thought you could forestall your inevitable decline as a society was to return to what they called first principles, right? And so much of the fights that we've had over the meaning and the legacy of the American Revolution for nearly 250 years, in large part has been about choosing and defining and justifying which first principles come from the revolution, and this desire to return to them is a sort of expression of a sense that we have as Americans, that there is some kind of sense of protection in looking back to the past, right?
Yeah. And for someone like Jefferson, he has certain first principles in mind, which he thought we had strayed from in the Washington and Adams administrations, but they clearly didn't think they had strayed from the principles that they had also helped to create.
Yeah, and many of the founders themselves, the ones who lived well into the 19th century, in their later years had a very sort of doom and gloom take on the revolution and just where the nation was going.
Yeah, it's always reassuring to see that we're not unique. And your book begins on a much more kind of cheerful though summer note with the story of Eliza Wadsworth.
Yeah, Eliza Wadsworth was this young woman. She was 20 years old in 1800, and she lived in Maine with her family. And her father was Peleg Wadsworth, who had been a Continental Army officer, and at the time was serving in Congress. And this is right around when George Washington dies at the end of 1799. And I found these letters in the Maine Historical Society where she writes to her father, who's in Philadelphia, and she's she asks him if he can maybe get her some memento of George Washington. She's so moved by the death of Washington, and she asks, maybe you could get a scrap of paper with this. Then she kind of goes a little further, and she asks, did he have hair, basically, and she sends this letter to her father, and her father was so moved by it, obviously as a Continental Army officer, he had a deep affection for Washington too, and so he sends her letter to Martha Washington. Wow. And a few weeks later, he gets a letter back from Tobias Lear, who was Washington's personal secretary, and in it, Martha Washington enclosed a lock of George Washington's hair. We know that that's a common practice in those days for famous individuals, that they would clip locks of hair to be given away to family members or sort of dignitaries. And for Martha Washington, she was so moved by this letter from this young girl that she sent the locks of hair. And then, unfortunately, Eliza Wadsworth died in 1802 from tuberculosis, and she left a lock of hair in the care of her sister, and then who then left it in the care of her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who eventually donated the letters and the lock of hair in a locket to the Maine Historical Society, where it's still there today.
It's amazing. And did you find many other mementos of the Revolution that people are keeping as a way of holding on to that legacy?
Yeah, I didn't go deep into more deeply into that kind of thing, like historical artifacts, unless you count the Declaration and the Constitution as historical artifacts, which I talk about, the care and the keeping of documents later. But there is some work on people in the early 19th century treating not even objects from the period, but just there isn't a sort of beginnings of kind of material culture in the early 19th century, and Washington's death plays a role in that. All of a sudden, his fleet is on all kinds of things, from tankards to textiles to anything you can imagine, and people would buy those and they would treat them as these sort of sacred relics. That's what the scholarship was. So, and the same thing I talk in the book about how that grew even more in the 1820s with Lafayette's visit. And I mean, there's a sort of marketing explosion around him, and there's a great collection at Lafayette College of all these kinds of items that were being sold in those years with his face on it.
Right. And we'll just talk for a minute about, because we have in Washington at the National Archives the shrine with the Charters of Freedom, and so we look at this and we think this has been there since time immemorial. But your book tells us it's actually a relatively new thing in the history of the Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of surprising to think about it, but the actual parchments of the Declaration and the Constitution, let's say, were not especially well cared for throughout the 19th century, right? And it starts to come to light. In fact, for most of the 19th century, the Declaration is kept in a drawer in the U.S. Patent Office. And people start to become aware of this during the centennial of 1876, when the documents were brought to Philadelphia to be put on display for the centennial exposition there. And people are seeing the Declaration, and it's already very faded. Now it's not. It hasn't gotten that much worse because of preservation efforts. But so people had a real emotional reaction to traveling a long way to Philadelphia to see the Declaration, and they can't even barely read the name. And so it sparked a little public outcry, and the Congress apportioned money for preservation efforts for the documents. But even then, it took a few decades for those efforts to really begin. And there's some argument about that some of the earliest efforts in the late 19th century to preserve the document might have done more harm than good. And then, of course, they get transferred to the Library of Congress in the early 20th century, and Herbert Putnam was the librarian of Congress, and he was very protective of the fact that these documents were at the library. And during the Roosevelt presidency, when the National Archives was created, Roosevelt and a lot of other people thought that these documents belonged at the National Archives. And there was a lot of political squabbling that had to go on to eventually get those documents to move. In fact, Roosevelt said we basically have to wait for Putnam to die or leave the position to be able to move these documents, which they did. And there was a big procession of moving these documents in the very early 50s to the National Archives, where they sit today.
Yeah, it's really an extraordinary story. And we're talking with Michael Hattem, who is the author of The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. And you make the point in the book about how this is all part of the Cold War and thinking about what the importance of the revolution is for Americans as opposed to the Soviets and communism that were in this struggle. And these documents are really critical to how the Americans will think about themselves and their own history.
Yeah. It's the importance of the Cold War is kind of sort of one of the more surprising aspects of writing the book. But it's in 1952 when those documents are moved from the Library of Congress through what was basically a military procession from the Library of Congress to the National Archives, and it is occurring in this very early Cold War context of the 1950s, and what happens in the very late 40s and the 1950s is because of the Cold War, there is a real sense of political and cultural urgency to define Americanism or the United States in opposition to this new, geopolitical enemy, the Soviet Union. And so a few ideas that had emerged in the 1910s, 1920s, in response to the progressive movement and the Bolshevik Revolution, this is when the ideas of individualism really starts to become more prominent. The idea that the Constitution is about limited government, right? This idea that the Constitution, the first principle of the Constitution, is about limited government. That also arises in the 1910s and 1920s. It's really not until the Cold War period that these principles sort of come together, and the liberty that the Declaration, the liberty that Jefferson talks about in the Declaration, starts to become talked about as individual liberty, right? Rather than say liberty of the society as a whole. It's this more libertarian reading of the Declaration. And what's interesting about that is that for most of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the Declaration was a document for liberals and liberal social, what we would think of as liberals. And the Constitution, had been a document, that had been more favored by for slave owners before the Revolution, and the new elite and status quo during the Gilded Age, and those two documents, a lot of the book is about the contest between the Declaration and the Constitution over which is the defining document of the Revolution, right? But it's really in the early 1950s that conservatives, especially anti-communists, come up with a way to reconcile those two documents, really almost for the first time, I would say. And they do it by saying that the Declaration is about the right of individual liberty, the liberty of the individual. And the Constitution is about limited government, because you limit government to protect the liberty of the individual, right? And it's such a neat reconciliation of those two documents. And that it spreads widely, becomes really predominant. And in fact, it's 75 years later, and still many Americans think of the Revolution in that way. It's a real sort of sea change moment, I think, in the memory of the American Revolution to reconcile those documents in such a neat and tidy way.
It is. And you make the point about how the abolitionist movement in many ways creates the idea of the Declaration as the liberty-giving document. Earlier it had been the grievances were the issue up until about the time of the 1820s, 1830s.
Yeah, I mean, in the first 50 years, really, of the nation, the Declaration, it wasn't necessarily venerated the way that it has become venerated.
Hmm.
It was thought of mostly on July 4th, and of course, Jefferson would get a lot of credit for that,
Hmm.
to John Adams' annoyance,
Right.
full annoyance, right? But the way that people thought about the Declaration was that it symbolized independence from Britain,
Hmm.
symbolized the union of the states. And it really wasn't until abolitionists in the 1830s and 1840s really adopted the Declaration. And, they mentioned the Declaration in abolitionist newspapers and speeches.
Hmm.
I mean, so often, and because uh, they're grabbing onto the Declaration's idea of liberty and equality, and they
Hmm.
define the Declaration by those two principles, not
Hmm.
independence and union, but by liberty and equality. And
Right.
that's really a new thing in the 1830s. And uh, and that essentially creates the modern memory of the Declaration of Independence, and that would later be sort of reiterated for a more uh, for a broader audience by Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address.
Right. Right. And also with the other big Cold War event, if we can go back to that for a minute, is the publication of the Jefferson Papers, the Adams Papers. And you really make a point of how fraught, particularly the Jefferson Papers were, because even though he meticulously kept everything, it was scattered by the time the idea comes to publish them.
Yeah, his papers were treated even worse than the Declaration and the Constitution. In the mid 19th century, his his immediate descendants were trying to raise money to cover the debts that that were left, and obviously they sold Monticello. That there's the story about that is in the book as well, but
Yeah.
to a local pharmacist. But
Hmm.
they also offered his papers to sell his papers to the federal government. Uh, and there was an agreement made, and the documents were sent to the government, and they would decide which were public and
Hmm.
which were private, and they would keep the public and they would send the private
Yeah.
documents back. And that process took decades.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of politics that was involved with the selection of those documents, which I talk about in the book. But so basically, uh, by the time that you get around to the 1930s or 1940s, Jefferson's papers, which he had kept neatly organized, really
Hmm.
obsessively organized,
Oh, yeah.
were scattered all over the place. And so, as part of this post-World War II context, and a part of defining, the uh, the the nation and the revolution in opposition to the Soviet Union, the publication and the collection of these Jefferson papers becomes a really big deal. I want to say real quick about the Cold War stuff is, the Cold War memory of the revolution, which is what I call it, really is three principles. It's individual liberty.
Hmm.
Of course, that contrasts directly with the collectivism
Right.
of Soviet communism. Uh, Limited government, right, which is also contrasts directly with a centralized bureaucracy.
Hmm.
And then, of course, free trade or capitalism is the third
Right.
principle, which contrasts, of course, with socialism. But the Jefferson Papers and the other papers of the founders that were published, and the projects that were started later in the 1950s, are part of this milieu. And the idea is, we need to redefine America in these terms. And
Hmm.
the way to do that is to go back to the papers of the founders and to make them as widely available and in as scholarly a way as possible, right? Lots of historians know, but Julian Boyd, who was the editor of the Jefferson Papers and was a former librarian at Princeton, he really created a lot of standards,
Right.
documentary editing and scholarly editing that are still a part of the practice today. So the
Hmm.
Jefferson Papers is really significant in a lot of ways, but not least because of its role in this sort of cultural Cold War.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to see that the Jefferson Papers have this connection with Princeton, but he also gets support to raise money from the Adolf Sulzberger,
Yeah.
the New York Times then is a co-sponsor of this, and the Adams Papers, it's Time Magazine,
Yeah.
who is the co-sponsors. You have this both universities with the strong media component. So every time there's a volume or something happening with the Adams Papers, there's a spread in Life magazine.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I talk about that in the book, and it's really fascinating to look at. These issues are actually available on Google, the old Life magazine issues. But yeah, that's how big a deal, right?
Yeah.
These publications were. When the Jefferson Papers published its first volume, there's a spread in Life magazine, and for the Adams Papers, not even when the first volume was published, but when a deal was made between the Adams Family Trust, who controlled the Adams Family paper really tightly. When they struck a deal with the Massachusetts Historical Society and with Life magazine, there was an enormous, like 15-page full color spread of documents and all kinds of things in what was, probably like one of, if not the, most widely circulated periodicals in the country in the early 1990s. That's what a big deal the publication of those volumes occasioned. And of course, many of those founders' projects, the Jefferson Papers, the Adams Papers, the Washington Papers, the Madison Papers, those are continuing.
Oh, yeah.
It's 75 years later, and they have still not finished publishing all of these edited documents. That's what a major project these papers projects were. And I think a lot of people don't think about how significant they are, because there had been lots of editions earlier that were not very scholarly. But the amount of money that has been put and the amount of time that's been put into these volumes of founders' papers will never be done again. These are the final editions of the founders' papers. And there's a real weight. I worked at the Franklin Papers as a grad student, and you even as an assistant at the Franklin Papers, you kind of felt the weight of that responsibility.
It's amazing. Yeah, and C.L. Sulzberger, when he helped sponsor the New York Times sponsors us, the first volume is dedicated to his father-in-law, the Adolf Oakes, the founder of the Times.
Yeah, it's an interesting collaboration, right, between the sort of academic world of universities, and also the sort of corporate sector, right, the private sector, and then also the mass media, right. All three of these, very different sectors of American society all felt that there was an important, that they had a stake in these projects, and that there was a real importance to sharing the founders' words with the American public.
It's amazing. And of course, it's under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the Jefferson Memorial gets built, which is, again, a shrine to Jefferson, the Greek temple, with the quote they picked from Jefferson is, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man," which is...
Yeah. There's also, one of the other quotes in there is about the need that government needs to change over time.
Yeah. Right? That's right. Yeah.
And it's a good reminder of the fact that Jefferson, it's easy to think now the way that, Jefferson is not adored by many liberals today, of course, and really it's been that way since the bicentennial. But in the 1910s or 1920s, Jefferson became the sort of avatar for the new Democratic Party, the new, not just Southerners Democratic Party, and the Progressive Democratic Party, and this is when Monticello is bought by a consortium of Democrats to turn it into a house museum, basically what we see today, and basically give this new Democratic Party legitimacy by connecting it back to the founding through Thomas Jefferson. And Roosevelt was a huge fan of Jefferson, of course, and that's why he was one of the prime movers behind the creation of the Jefferson Memorial. And the fact that it was, that it was being stoked by, New Deal Democrats is why that specific quote is included among some other It's a reminder of the context. And then, of course, over the 1960s and 1970s, as Jefferson's reputation starts to decline amongst Democrats and progressives, mostly because of the issue of race and slavery, he becomes readopted by Republicans and conservatives as a sort of avatar, not of the New Deal, but of small government, right? It's a reminder of how malleable founders' legacies can be.
Yeah, I remember there was a thing in Esquire magazine back in the 70s about how you know if you're a liberal, how you know if you're conservative, and Jefferson is on both lists. Is your affinity is with Thomas Jefferson, that he belongs in both places.
That's the liminal moment for his reputation.
Yeah. You also a thing that sometimes we forget. We talk about the founders sometimes. We as historians don't, but as this monolithic group. And again, you remind us that Warren Harding coined the term founding fathers, and that they did disagree quite a bit on what.
Yeah, the term founding fathers is interesting. The term fathers was used in the 19th century sometimes. I mean, Lincoln used it.
Yeah.
Sometimes Jefferson would be called the father of American independence, or Washington would be referred to as the father of the nation. But it's not until the 1910s, 1916 specifically, at the Republican National Convention, where Warren Harding coins the term founding fathers. And it's become sort of, so ubiquitous in American culture, right? In the century since that I think a lot of people think that term has just always existed, but it has a specific origin in the 1910s, partly because progressives in the very early 20th century began a sort of campaign of what they thought of as myth busting, and there were a lot of true histories of the Revolution written in the early 20th century, and then of course there was Charles Beard's famous book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, where he basically says that the founders at the convention just voted according to their economic interests, and this sort of burst the bubble of the idea that the founders at the convention were motivated by high-minded ideals of liberty and republicanism, and instead they were just voting based on their pocketbooks. And so there was a real reaction to Beard's book, a public reaction. It was and it sparked a real a lot of condemnation from conservative Republicans, especially. And Harding owned the newspaper, the Marion Star in Ohio, which actually was one of the more vociferous critics of Beard and his book. And so the term founding fathers is by Harding comes in that context, and it's about sort of reasserting, the importance, if not the infallibility, of the founding generation, especially the most famous founders that we think of.
Interesting. We're talking with Michael Hattem, author of The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. And I'm just wondering, sometimes we as scholars, maybe we don't imagine ourselves being simply disinterested and just focusing on the past. I mean, is it possible? I mean, how much does the kind of popular understanding of this bleed into the historiography, or vice versa, do you think?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and one that I try to wrestle with in the book. The academic historians, that as a profession only sort of emerges in the late 19th century, right? In the 19th century, some of the most famous historians, if we think of like George Bancroft, he comes from a very elite New England family, and is writing from a place of leisure. But academic historians who are professors, that's a very late 19th century thing. And over the course of the 20th century, there have been a few moments where the arguments that historians make sort of seep out into the popular culture, and Beard is probably the first of those, and probably still the most significant. But there are others, especially if we think about in the 1960s and 1970s. New scholarship on issues of race and gender had a real impact on the dialogue around the bicentennial. If we think a little bit earlier in the 1950s, in the Cold War context, there were academic historians like Daniel Boorstin and
Hmm.
Richard Hofstadter, Louis Hartz, who were publishing books, if not about the revolution, but about early American history,
Right.
that were read by huge numbers
Oh,
of
yeah.
Americans. Real bestsellers, really.
Oh, yeah.
But since the 70s, that's changed significantly as
Hmm.
historians have become more specialized, and as their topics of focus have changed.
Hmm.
So it's become much less common in recent years, I think, for scholarly work to have a big, cultural impact.
And we lament that. But then we can talk about it, can go in a number of different directions with that particular line of analysis, and we resent that until your book sells more than mine, and then I don't lament the fact that mine don't. Well, anyway, but then you mentioned a couple of episodes where there is Beard is one, and then there have been other kind of big explosions of interest and things. David McCullough certainly wrote books that sold a lot of copies, and other historians have as well. Joe Ellis is another one who's written for a popular audience, and
well, that's those two authors especially are probably well known to many listeners. They are part of a sort of explosion of writing about the founders, about the founding, particularly the founders and biographies of the founders in the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s, right? Joe Ellis's first book is American Sphinx. Well, his first popular book is American Sphinx, which is 1996, and it's about Jefferson and how unknowable Jefferson was. And then, of course, David McCullough's book on John Adams, which is the most popular of all of them, comes out in 2001. And these are books that focused on the character of the founder. Right? They're not, deep political histories necessarily. They're biographical, and they're really trying to get a handle on what the character of these founders is. That's a very slippery term. But if we think about the context in which these books were being written and being very popular, in the late 90s, the Clinton scandals. I mean, you couldn't turn on the TV or look at a newspaper in the late 90s without a headline or hearing about a Clinton scandal, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a real sort of crisis of confidence in politicians generally, but especially at the highest level, that really started with Watergate, but just continued into the 90s. And so people are looking at their current leaders and thinking, they don't seem to have a lot of character. Maybe we should go back to the founding generation and see what it was about their character that made them, so unique and so much better than politicians today. And so that's a really important part of the context of the success of those books by Ellis and Ford.
And I was just reflecting that at the time of Watergate, there was kind of a boom of interest in Harry Truman, because he seemed like a plain-speaking guy who spoke. When he left office, he was really held in he was at the lowest ratings of any incumbent president, and then rediscovered. Are we discovering things in the past that we need for the present, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of, that's the through line of the book, as the sort of nation's origin story, or origin myth, as I call it. The purpose of that is, of any origin story or origin myth, just like ancient societies had, is to explain how a society came to be, right? And to say something about the character of the nation and its people and its sort of core principles. And so just like, Rome had the story of Romulus and Remus, which had many different versions that people subscribed to over many years. We have the sort of the origin myth of the memory of the revolution. And it serves a very similar purpose for us. The memory of the revolution, the study of the memory of the revolution, really tells you more about the people who are remembering the revolution than the revolution itself, right? And I think as a nation, you need that. There needs to be a grounding, and because of the sort of unique circumstances of the revolution and how documented it was and everything. It's been so malleable throughout American history that it's been able to be adopted, by, what Federalists and Republicans all the way to, far left and far right groups. I'll talk about that in the book too. It's just so malleable that anybody can find what they want in the revolution.
Yeah. It's great. And we're talking with Michael Hattem, author of The Memory of 76. And you have in your beginning, when you discuss the idea of the hero, the taxonomy kind of the hero, and the hero isn't an individual in this case so much as it is this idea of the nation or the revolution itself, as it's making choices and doing things that in Greek myths or Roman myths, the hero would be doing.
Yeah. The hero, there's a well-known story structure called the hero's journey, which Joseph Campbell uncovered in the mid 20th century through his study of many ancient hero myths, especially Western hero myths. And it's just a sort of sequence of common plot points that he found in these myths. And what I found when sort of looking at it is that, we essentially tell the story of the revolution broadly according to this story structure. And people know this story structure because it was used by George Lucas to write Star Wars.
Right.
It's a Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. They all, follow this sort of very popular story structure because it has this inherent power, because it's been around so long, to elicit a real emotional connection among people. And so we've told the story in this way. And I think that helps explain why Americans have such a unique emotional connection to the revolution, that a big part of it is how we tell the story of the revolution. And so I hope, that readers come away from the book with, a greater sense of the importance of how the story is told, and a greater awareness of, when they see that happening in the present, especially as the 250th anniversary approaches.
Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with Michael Hattem, author of The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. His previous book was Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. And Michael directs the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. And I really want to thank you for joining us. This has been a great discussion of this great book.
Thank you for having me, Bob. I appreciate it.
And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, and our listeners, around the world. Michael, when we started these podcasts, we thought we'd have, a handful of our friends maybe tuning in occasionally, but we have a really steady and engaged group of listeners really around the world. And every week we thank some of them in different places. And so if you're in one of these places and want to send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org, he'll send you some of our Rev 250 swag, and you can then be part of this remembering of the revolution at the 250th, and we can argue about what it means. So this week, our friends in Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, Savannah, 4 cities involved in the revolution, and in Charlotte, North Carolina, Detroit, Kalamazoo, Aurora, Colorado, St. Catharines in Ontario, Westminster, of course, in the UK, Hingham and South Dennis here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Steubenville, Ohio, Huntington, West Virginia, and Amman, Jordan, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.